Alright, so now we're going to talk about another concept that's crucial to pretty much all programming languages, and that's functions. So functions by definition are just reusable groups of statements. So it's code that you can run over and over again, and it prevents you from having to duplicate your code. So for example, down here, starting on line 161, I'm basically converting 10 degrees Celsius to Fahrenheit. So we saw that equation up above. So let's say that I wanted to convert 10 degrees Celsius to Fahrenheit. I could run it through that equation right here on line 161. And let's say I want to do it again for 50 degrees Celsius, convert that to Fahrenheit by running it through that equation. And let's say I wanted to do that many more times. So I want to convert a bunch of numbers from Celsius to Fahrenheit. So I could go ahead and do it like you see here, where I'm just rewriting that equation over and over again, and all I'm doing is just substituting the number in Celsius, but repeating the equation over and over and over again. That's not very efficient. And on top of that, I may have to do it 1,000 times. In a program, you may have to convert 1,000 degrees Celsius over and over and over again 1,000 times. So hopefully you can see how it's not efficient to do that. And on top of that, it's error prone, because if I slip up just one number here, I've miscalculated, and that can throw everything off. So when you're repeating code like this, you do run the risk of making errors too, and it just becomes not very manageable. It becomes hard to maintain. So what we can do to remedy this situation right here is we can create what's called a function. So what we'll do, and I have that down here, starting on line 172, we're creating a function here that will convert Celsius to Fahrenheit, and then every time we want to do the conversion, we just use this function, and that way we put the equation to actually do the conversion in one place, and every time we want to convert a Celsius temperature to Fahrenheit, we just use this function, and we don't have to repeat the code over and over again. So that's the concept. Now let's take a look at the syntax for creating or defining a function. So first here on line 172, we have this keyword called function. So anytime you want to create your own function, it starts with this word function right here. So that's a keyword or a reserved word in JavaScript. And then after that you put a space, and then you give your function a name. So I've named this function convert to Fahrenheit. And then you have parentheses here, and inside of those parentheses you can add what are known as parameters, but I think it's intuitive to call them inputs. So this would be the temperature in Celsius that we want to input into this function, and then we'll convert that temperature Celsius to Fahrenheit. So up above, for example, we wanted to convert 10 degrees Celsius to Fahrenheit. So I'll show you how to use the function later, but when the function is running in the code, the equation is getting processed here. We have this temperature Celsius, and that will be the input. So in this example, let's say we're going to feed 10 degrees Celsius into this function. You can think of this parameter name right here, and I've called it temp Celsius, but you could name your parameters whatever you want. You can think of this as a placeholder for whatever the actual value is that got fed into the function when you used it. So for example, when we use the function, and I'll show you that in a minute, we pass in, or the input is set to 10, then anywhere we see temp Celsius right here, we can just replace that with 10. So this parameter name right here that goes in between the parentheses, this is basically a placeholder for the inputs that we are feeding into the function. And you can see, so if we feed in 10 degrees Celsius, we use that placeholder here in our equation, and we actually assign it to another variable that we declared right here that we call temp Fahrenheit. And when we get temp Fahrenheit figured out by solving this expression here, then we do what we call returning the value. So here's another keyword in JavaScript called return. So that's what allows this function to return the result. Alright, so I know you're probably having lots of questions in your head still, but let's just go ahead and we'll come back to some of the stuff, but I want to show you now that we've defined the function right here, we can go ahead and use it. But I also want to finish talking about the syntax here. So as I said, we start with this, every function starts with the function keyword, and then we give it a name. There's our function name, and if there's any inputs that get fed into the function, and those are called parameters, we specify the parameters right here inside the parentheses, and then we have a set of curly braces. So everything in between these curly braces is what's known as the body of the function, and that's the grouping of code that's going to run every time we use this function. So here's my starting curly brace on line 172, and here's its matching closing curly brace. So everything in between those curly braces is what's known as the body of the function, and that's basically the code that we want to run every time we use the function. There's not a lot of code inside the body of this function. We're just doing one quick equation and then we're returning the result. So only 2 lines of code in there. Alright, so that's how you define a function in JavaScript. So now that we've defined it, we can go ahead and use it. So how do you use a function? I'm going to scroll down here, and down on line 189 here, I'm actually using this function 3 times. The first time I'm using it, I'm passing in 10. So that's going to be the parameter. That's going to be the input that we feed into the function, and it's going to work on that input and turn it into degrees Fahrenheit. So in this case, when we use this function right here and we input 10 into it, we can go back and look at the body of the function up here, and we'll see, so 10 degrees Celsius is going to be our parameter. So basically we have to give that a name so we know how to refer to it inside of our function. So we've got a parameter name of temp Celsius, and we can kind of think of it as a placeholder for 10 degrees in the case of line 189, because that's what we're passing in as our parameter. But when we're defining the function, we don't know what they're going to pass into it, so we have to use some sort of identifier for it. So that's what temp Celsius is in this case. And then, as I said, everywhere throughout the body of the function, like right here on line 173, we can kind of think of it as a placeholder for what they used as an input into the function, what they passed into the function, we say, the value that they passed into the function. Alright, so let's go back down to where we're using the function. So we're using the function 3 times here on lines 189, 190, and 191. The first time we're inputting 10 degrees Celsius, the second time we're inputting 50 degrees Celsius, and the third time we're inputting 75 degrees Celsius. So every time you use a function, the technical term for it is you're invoking the function. So once you've defined the function and you're ready to use it, you can invoke the function like we're doing here on these 3 lines right here. The other word for that is calling the function. That means the same thing as invoking the function. So right here on line 189, we're calling the function and we're passing in a value of 10 degrees. So that's our parameter. We're passing in 10 degrees. And then since that function returned something, we can actually assign the return value of this function to a variable. So I've got 3 variables that are being declared here, and each one of them is being assigned the result of the function. So here we're converting 10 degrees, here we're converting 50 degrees, and here we're converting 75 degrees. Alright, we'll be talking more about functions. Let's talk more about functions. So if you want, you can go ahead and uncomment out lines 202 through 206. So I'm just removing those whack splat and splat whack, so that this code will run right here, and we will see our function in action in the browser if we do that. So I'm going to click save, then I'm going to go over to the browser. Alright, so now I'm in the browser here. I'm just going to make sure I'm recording, and I'm going to pull up the console, and you can see here is the result of our functions being logged out to the console. And we can take a look at that code. Whoops, close this here. Now, I'm not even sure if I explained this console log before, but we talked about it in class, so you should be familiar with that. That just puts a message in our console for us. And you can see, we'll get to the details of this going on here, but the message that we're logging in the console says 10 degrees Celsius is, and then we're squirting in that value of F1, which was from up here on line 189, where we fed in 10 degrees. So this will be the Fahrenheit value of 10 degrees Celsius, and here's our three messages right here. I'm going to go ahead and put the comments back in here. I'm just pressing Control Z, which is undo. So we'll put the comments back in place. Now, I want to point out that this console.log, this is a function, and down here on line 208 you'll see that alert, which we've been using and we know what that does now, is also a function, and same with prompt. Prompt is also a function in JavaScript. Now, those three functions, alert, prompt, and console.log, are functions that are built into JavaScript. We didn't define these anywhere, they just come with the language. So you can tell that they're a function because they have the parentheses after them. Alright, so you can always spot a function, because sometimes if you're not sure, if you're looking at some code that's a function or a variable, if you see the parentheses, you'll know that it's a function. Alright, let's talk a little bit more about functions here. So I'm going to go down to line 212 here, and it says, note that you can pass a variable into a function as a parameter, which is what we did. We passed, oh, I'm sorry. So what we're doing, where is it? Oh, I'm getting confused here. Hang on a second. Alright, so right here on line 189, we're just passing in a value. But I could also pass in a variable also. So if I needed to, I could create a variable here, Rx equals 25 degrees Celsius, and then I could pass in x into this function if I wanted to. And this would in effect be passing 25 into my function. A lot of times, as we were saying before, we don't know what functions are going to be set to. So in this case, we're setting it ourselves, but in lots of cases, the user will set the value of a function and we won't know what it is. So in that case, we can just pass in the variable instead of some value. All right, I'm going to undo that, remove that code. Then I'm going to go back to where we left off, which was on okay, 212. So that's just a message saying that you can pass in literal values, they're called. That's or you can pass in variables. All right. So on line 216, I have an example that does just that. So let's uncomment this code here. So I'm uncommenting. I'm removing the comment on line 215 and then the closing comment on line 219. So let's just take a look at this code right here. First, we're declaring a variable called Celsius today, and then to assign a value to that variable, we're using that prompt function that we've been using. And here's the message that it's going to say. It's going to say, what's the temp today in Celsius? Then whatever the user enters is going to be assigned to Celsius today. And then on the next line, on line 217, we're calling our function that we created earlier, convert. I don't like that pop-up menu. coming up. I got to figure out how to make that go away. But anyways, so on line 217, we're invoking the function that we created, which we called convert to Fahrenheit. And look at what we're passing in here. We're passing in, as a parameter, we're passing in the variable Celsius today. So this will be our parameter inside that function. And so whatever the user enters into that prompt is going to be what gets passed into this function call right here. And then that function returns a value, which is the degrees converted to Fahrenheit, and that value will be stored in the Fahrenheit today variable. And then here we're just alerting it out so we can see what the conversion is. So this alert will say today's temp in Fahrenheit is, and then we're adding in the value of whatever Fahrenheit today was. Okay, I'll let you go ahead and run that if you want to, but go ahead and save the file and then go over to the browser and run it, and you should see that those lines of code in action. And then you can come back here, and I'm just going to hit Control Z a couple times to put the comments back in, because we're done looking at that code and we don't want to see it again, so we're ready to move on. Okay, the next item here is that functions can take more than one parameter. So in the example that we showed you up above, our function just took one parameter. And that makes sense because all we were doing was converting Celsius to Fahrenheit, so we didn't really need to pass in any more inputs. But there'll be times when you want to pass in more than one input, or you'll want your function to have more than one parameter. So if that's the case, you can go ahead and declare your function the same way we talked about before. You use the function keyword, and then you give it a name. Your function name goes here, and then you can specify the names of your parameters. And put a comma between each one. So this function right here takes two parameters, and I've just called them param1 and param2, but we can call them whatever we want. So when we want to refer to the actual values that get passed into the function when we actually invoke it or use the function, we can use param1 to refer to the first input that gets passed in, and param2 to refer to the second input that gets passed in. So you'll see I called this some useless function because all it basically does is it creates an alert that tells you what you passed in as parameters. So you'll see when we call this function, or when we invoke this function, you'll see this alert pop up, and it will say you passed in the following params, and then it will show param1 and then param2. So let's go see that function in action right here. That's on line 226. So go ahead and uncomment line 226, and we might as well uncomment line 227 as well. So we're going to be calling this function two times, once on line 226 and once on line 227. So the first time we call it, we're going to pass in a string that a string value of sugar, and the second parameter is going to be a string value of spice. So we can go look inside the body of the function and see what happens to those parameters that we pass in. So here we have to identify those inputs that get passed in, and in our function definition up here is where we identify the first parameter as param1. So everywhere throughout the body of the function, when we want to refer to that value, and in this case on line 226, the first parameter was set to sugar, so we can just think of param1 in this case as a placeholder for the value sugar, and we can think of param2 as a placeholder for the value of spice. Now, like I said, every time you call the function, you might be passing in something different, but when we define our function, we need to know how to identify those parameters by name. So that's why we create these parameter names right here in the definition of our function, and they become the placeholders for those values that get passed into the function, or those inputs. Okay, so here on line 227, we're calling that function again, or we're invoking that function. Calling and invoking are the same thing, but this time we're passing in variables. Now these two variables are variables that we declared and initialized up above somewhere. So just showing here that you can pass in values. So right here I'm passing in a string value and another string value, and here I'm passing in a variable. Now this variable has a value assigned to it, but a lot of times what we pass in are variables instead of string values, or any values really, because like I was saying, a lot of times we don't know what the value is going to be, because something that the user does might set the value. So that's why on line 227 I'm just passing in a variable, and that variable has a value. Alright, moving on, and you can go ahead and run this code and see how it works, but I'm going to skip that, and I'm just going to go ahead and comment out those two lines and move on, and then let's go down to line 233. So here on line 233 I have a function that I'm defining, or I'm creating a function here. So it starts with that function keyword, then I put a space, and then I put my function name right there. It's called do something, and then I've got my parentheses. So what I want to point out here is that this function doesn't take any inputs. It has no parameters. So the parentheses are empty here, and that's okay. You'll have functions that you don't need to feed anything into it. Sometimes functions just do stuff, and you don't have to feed in a value. Also, I want you to notice that not all functions return something. So if the function, our convert to Fahrenheit function, if we look back up at that, that's on line, way back up here on line 174, you can see that that function is returning a value. So we take in the temp Celsius, we convert it to Fahrenheit, and then we return the value of temp Fahrenheit. So in that case, since this function returns a value, right down here on line 189, when we actually use the function, because that function returns a value, we can assign the value that it returns to a variable. So in this case, because convert to Fahrenheit returns a value, it makes sense to declare a variable and set it equal to whatever this function returns. Some functions don't return anything. So in that case, it wouldn't make sense to do this. It wouldn't make sense to call a function and assign a return value to a variable here, because some functions don't return anything. So let's go back down to that example, which is down here on line 233. So we can see here this function do something doesn't actually return anything. Alright, so the point is that functions may or may not have parameters. In other words, they may or may not take any inputs, and functions may or may not return values. So you could uncomment line 237 right here and watch that code run in the browser. So you could uncomment it, save your file, go over to the browser and hit refresh. Hopefully you're catching on to that right now. So now note here on line 237, I'll just go ahead and comment this out, or remove the comment. Even though this function, which we call do something, it doesn't take any inputs, we still need to use the parentheses when we call the function, or when we invoke the function, when we use the function. So even if a function doesn't take any parameters, you still need to include the parentheses when you want to use the function. Alright, go ahead and put the comments back in there, and let's see what else we have. Alright, I think that's going to do it for this video. So that's all you need to know about functions for now, at least.